समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The Indian Air Force has reluctantly, and I would say reverentially, retired its MiG-21, the last MiG-21 variant in its service. I could also use that other adjective that aviators like to use about aircraft that they've fallen in love with, that have transcended generations. That is venerable. So the venerable MiG-21 is now gone. The last version or addition to be flying with the Indian Air Force now for quite some time was the Bison version. Bison was developed from something that came up in 1990s, early 1990s. That was BIS, B-I-S, and then HAL and Indian Air Force worked on it. And there's a question about who named it Bison and why it was named Bison. I checked around. Looks like the HAL claims that they called it Bison because it was the BIS version, the last version that the Russians produced or the Soviets produced of the MiG, and they said BIS on. That means more improvement on the BIS was called Bison. However, this is disputed. I don't know. I can only tell you that this was the last of the MiG-21s. This was in the 23rd Squadron of the Indian Air Force. 23rd Squadron, as like all squadrons in the Air Force have names, 23rd Squadron is called the Panthers. This ceremony is taking place in Chandigarh because Chandigarh is where the first official squadron, operational squadron, full squadron, the 47th was raised in 1966. 47th, the Black Archers. That one is now flying MiG-29s. Those are the aircraft you saw lined up behind Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he landed up at Adampur to address Air Force people with the backdrop of MiG-29s and S-400 batteries. So that was the first squadron. The first official squadron was raised in Chandigarh, and that's why it's fitting that the retirement ceremony is also taking place in Chandigarh. Now, there isn't that much more I can tell you about the MiG-21 that many other experts haven't told you already. Or if you are a nerd, if you follow the defense Twitter, for example, I would suggest very strongly that go check out Anchit Gupta. Anchit Gupta, because he is not just a nerd, but he's a wonderful historian of Indian military aviation. He's been running a daily series. Every day, he said he started it a month back, and he said every day leading up to 26th of September. That is the day the aircraft will formally retire from IAF service. Every day, he will run a series of information about the aircraft. That stuff is fascinating. I would commend it to you. You will see some of that running on your screens as I talk. So there isn't very much I can do by way of adding to that. Anchit has also written an article for us, scheduled for publication on Friday. We'll share a link with you the moment the link is ready with the description. Now, MiG-21, you will ask me MiG. From where does the name come? Now, you might have seen Mikoyan, right? MiG is not just from Mikoyan, because if it's Mikoyan, then it will not become MiG. It's an interesting little factoid. This MiG actually is a combination of two design bureaus. So one was the Mikoyan Design Bureau. That one was the Mikoyan Design Bureau. That was led by Artem Mikoyan. The Soviets are brilliant at this. They have these designers. They name their weapon systems after the designers. That's why Mr. Kalashnikov will remain immortal. The AK series of rifles, right? You can have AK-47, 54, 103, 203, so on and so forth. Mr. Kalashnikov has gone a long time back, but his name will remain. And that's what the Soviets do with their aircraft designers also. That is why Sukhoi, it has come from the Sukhoi Design Bureau. Now, Now, Mikoyan was named after Artem Mikoyan. Artem Mikoyan was born in 1905, died in 1970. He had a contemporary, and the contemporary was Mikhail Gurevich, who was born in 1893, a bit earlier than Mikoyan, and lived a bit longer. He died in 1976. They combined the two design bureaus, and this yielded the MiG. MI in MiG comes from Mikoyan and G comes from Gurevich. Now, given what many of you already know about this aircraft, because this aircraft has been with Indian Air Force since I was 6 years old, since 1963. It was on March 2, 1963 that the first 6 MiGs came to India. These first MiGs had been stripped apart, they'd been taken apart and put in crates and shipped to India. So they arrived in Mumbai, what used to be Bombay then, on March 2, 1963. So that is like the official date on which the MiGs arrived in India. Then these were put together. Initially, these were flown by Russian pilots, who then certified these to be safe and fit to be flown. And then one Indian Air Force pilot, later Air Chief Marshal Dilbagh Singh, he rose to be the Chief of Air Staff. He became the first Indian pilot to fly a MiG-21. So these were 6. Of these 6, 3 unfortunately were lost. 2 were lost on the eve of Republic Day in a Republic Day fly-past rehearsal. Both the pilots survived fortunately. Both the pilots ejected and survived fortunately. So 2 were lost there. 1 more was lost in a runway accident. That makes it 3. Then after this, another lot of 6 came in. 6 plus 3. These 9 were the only MiGs available with the Indian Air Force when they went into war in 1965. These were very inadequately equipped. Only a couple of these had guns. The rest had only missiles. The first 6 aircraft that came, they had missiles. These were very rudimentary missiles. You really had to line them up precisely and from close enough with only visual sighting, because the first lot of MiGs did not have a radar. They were fully manual, but they had a gun. The second lot that came did not have guns. So even of the 9 that went into war in 1965, 2 were destroyed on day 1 in that famous or infamous Pakistani Air Force raid at Pathankot, and 1 was then lost in Adampur. So IAF was left with only 6, of which only a couple had guns. So we saw stories, we've heard stories, we've also seen archived stuff in books, in articles after that, of how some of the MiG-21 pilots in that war actually sighted Pakistani aircraft but not able to fire because they did not have guns, and how they ruled the fact that did not have guns. The most famous incident there was later Air Marshal M.S.T. Wallen, who retired as the Eastern Army Commander in Shillong, who sighted one Pakistani aircraft and then simply could not get the angle to fire the missiles, and finally just fired both his missiles in sheer frustration from an impossible angle and ruled the fact that he did not have a gun. After that, the subsequent editions went through the gun drama. So I will talk about some of that, but before that, I will use the MiG story. Now that I've told you when did the first MiGs came in, that means the MiG itself served the Indian Air Force for 62 years. That's why when you imagine Indian Air Force, you think of a delta-shaped aircraft. And Indian Air Force has loved the delta shape, and the MiG has made a contribution. So MiG was delta-shaped, Mirage 2000, perfect delta shape, and now the Tejas also has a delta shape. That is the Indian Air Force love affair with the delta. Indian Air Force is checkered and very difficult and challenging history of aircraft acquisitions, fighter aircraft acquisitions. That is what I will talk about today, using you might say the excuse. In my business, I would call it a news peg of the retirement of the MiG-21. So see how Indian Air Force has struggled right through history. Ever since India became independent, Indian Air Force has struggled to keep pace with Pakistanis, irrespective of the fact that Pakistanis actually have a much smaller economy, they can spend much less, they have much smaller defense budgets. That's because, one, Pakistanis have a doctrinal clarity. They know what they want to do. They have only one adversary, that's India. They can pretty much decide whether or when there will be any conflict with India or not. India never had the need to start any conflict, so Pakistanis have doctrinal clarity. They also know that they cannot match India in numbers. They also know that they cannot match India in resilience. So they look for what will give them technological superiority at any point of time. And you know what? They've had the privilege and the advantage of having a foreign partner or patron across the history since 1954. 1954, the Pakistanis signed up on SEATO, that is Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and started getting their Sabre jets. Now, India began worrying in the early 50s, because in the early 50s, it looked like 51, 52, Pakistan might launch a larger attack on India. This was after the first Kashmir War of 47, 48. And Indian Air Force then told the government that, look, we don't have jets that can fight. Because India had bought a bunch of Vampire jets from the British in 1948. Those were very basic jets. They were jets only in name. They could not really do what was modern combat even then. The other Indian aircraft were all Second World War propeller aircraft. So Indian Air Force was desperate. That is when the first acquisition Indian Air Force made was from the French, Dassault, the same companies that makes the Rafale. And you know what? Since the first acquisition from Dassault in 1953, the first Oregons, as these were called, India renamed them, Nehru renamed them Tufanis. They came in 1953. Then what happens? India gets the Oregons in 1953 and Pakistanis get their first Sabres in 1954. Those Sabre jets in 1954 that the Americans transferred to them immediately put Pakistan Air Force in a completely different dimension. Neither the Vampire nor the Oregon could last in the normal circumstances against a Sabre. Sabre was a generation and a half ahead. In fact, almost 2 generations ahead at that point. And India then had to play catch up. The story is that India has always been playing catch up even with a tiny adversary like Pakistan. Pakistan gets Sabres in 1954 and India starts worrying what is to be done. That is when Nehru goes around looking for fighter aircraft and signs up with the British to buy India's first Hunters. Now, Hawker Siddeley Hunter was almost an equivalent of the Sabre, although some distinctions came up later that made Sabre more challenging in the air to Hunter than it should normally have been. So India's first Hunters came in 1957. That is 3 years after the Pakistani Sabres. And this story continues after that. 1957, India bought the Hunters from the British. India also bought the Mystère from the French. That was the second aircraft that IAF bought from Dassault. Now, Sabre could carry out both the jobs. That is air superiority as well as ground attack or interdiction. The Hunter also could do both of those, and Hunter was used in both roles in both 65 and 71 wars, as was the Sabre. However, India needed something more dedicated to ground attack, and that was the Mystère. So Mystère came in 1957. This combination of Hunter and Mystère was then supposed to counter the F-86 Sabre jet, of which Pakistan was getting sizable numbers from the Americans besides training and tactical development, etc. Then what happens? Both air forces, Indian as well as Pakistanis, they also want bombers of some kind, and some competition goes on between both countries, and India wants to buy bombers, B-57 equivalent Canberras from the British. The British are taking their time, and that is when India then squeezes the British and the Americans by telling them that if you don't sell us these bombers that we want to buy, that we will pay for, then we will buy IL-28s, that is Illusion, from the Soviet Union, and that's where we find some documentation in the declassified records of the U.S. State Department for 1955-1957. There is a note there on 11th of March 1956, written from Colombo by John Foster Dulles, who was then Secretary of State, and he's written this on his way out of the subcontinent. So he writes to Eisenhower from Colombo, and he said, and he's describing his meeting with Nehru, and he says, and I'm reading it exactly as he's written it. The first day we had 3.5 hours together, just the two of us, that is John Foster Dulles and Nehru, in a most intimate way. I was amused that towards the end of the meeting, he, as in Nehru, towards the end of the meeting, Nehru was sitting on the back of the sofa with his feet on the seat. We really let our hair down. Now that is the happy part of the meeting. Then he goes on to say that India has, from Nehru I figured, that India has pathological fear of Pakistan. Pathological fear in the sense that they think that Pakistan is now being armed heavily by the Americans, by its Western partners. They are a member of Western alliances, and Pakistan might use this new weaponry to attack India, at least to attack Kashmir. And then he goes on to say, one most disturbing fact is that they are thinking of buying some military planes, I think IL-28 types, from the Russians. I had already been told by Selwyn Lloyd. Selwyn Lloyd was then the British Foreign Secretary. So John Foster Dulles' British counterpart. I had already been told by Selwyn Lloyd that this was a possibility, and he indicated that if these planes with Russian technicians were coming, then he was dubious whether they, as in the British, whether they should sell Canberras with special equipment to India. And then he goes on to say that I explained to Nehru that if they did so, then there will be bad consequences. And then he goes on to say in other documentation that he could see that Nehru was playing the game of squeeze play. That is, either you let this aircraft come to us, because remember, the British, the Americans are always allied. In the 50s, most certainly at the peak of the Cold War, it was an impossibility that the British would sell you such an equipment without the approval of the Americans. And he records that Nehru was indulging in squeeze play, as a result of which India got its first Canberras. It was at the same time that Pakistan also got its own version of the Canberras, the B-57s. Both sides used these bombers in 65 and 71 wars, mostly for night bombing. In Indian Air Force's service, Canberra continued for much longer. In fact, even in 1999, in the war in Kargil, Canberras were being used for photo reconnaissance, and one of those Canberras was hit by a surface-to-air missile, most likely a Stinger or Stinger equivalent, but this was a sturdy aircraft. It took the hit in one of its engines, and yet the pilot was able to land it safely, which was quite remarkable. So Canberra was in service until then. Now Canberras come in, I would say, in both air forces around 1957. In Indian Air Force in April 1957. So 1950s was a time of heavy acquisitions for Indian Air Force. However, every acquisition trailed the Pakistanis. Pakistanis now, 1961, got their first F-104 starfighters. India was still countering the Sabres. So by 1960, India had signed up with the British again, with Folland, the company there, to buy some Nats in flyaway condition, and then start assembling the rest at HAL. That became the first fighter aircraft to be assembled in India by HAL. That is the Nat, again used to great effect in 1965, and also in a slightly limited way in 1971 as well. Later, the IAF and HAL developed a variant called Ajit to keep it going for some more time. In fact, the Ajit flew up to 1989. However, by that time, technology had left it far, far behind. Now, see again what happens subsequently, because the same story continues after the 70s as well. The big change after the 70s, after 1971 war in the subcontinent, was Pakistan's acquisition of the F-16. Now, I know that before that, India bought the Jaguars. Jaguar, however, was an attack aircraft. Then it was called deep penetration strike aircraft. So Jaguar squadrons were still forming up. That was an Anglo-French deal, again later to be assembled by HAL. Pakistanis, on the other hand, in 1983, Pakistan got its first F-16s. That again shifted the balance in the air towards Pakistan, because F-16s then were a generation ahead of anything that anybody in the neighborhood had. In fact, anybody means India as well as China. So F-16s, the first F-16s came in 1983. That was a reward of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, because the Pakistanis said, you need our help, we are helping you, we've joined hands with you in this good jihad, so there has to be rent for it. So these came as a kind of rent, the first F-16s. And once again, the Indian Air Force was left behind and they had to play catch up. And how did they play catch up? Mrs. Gandhi ordered, Indira Gandhi, she ordered Mirage 2000. The first deliveries of Mirage 2000s came in 1985. The first squadron was raised fully, 7th Squadron, battle axis, by the end of 1985 or early 1986. So India was 3 years behind the Pakistanis. This at that point of time was more or less an equivalent of the F-16. And then what happened? In 1986, Indian Air Force probably, in fact for sure, wanted to buy or would have wanted to buy more Mirage 2000s, because they were liking the aircraft, they were getting used to it, and they thought they had developed tactics around it, and this was going to be the right answer for the F-16, and it was better to have more of one of a type instead of many others. However, there was Russian pressure, and there were also economic pressures internally, because French equipment is expensive. And with Russia and with Soviet Union then, India had the rupee-ruble trade and a lot of stuff going on barter. Because of those easy terms, India acquired the MiG-29 in 1986. That MiG-29 in 1986, because it was still visual war era, it did not use fly-by-wire, but it was such a beautifully designed aircraft and so strong that this could outturn the F-16 most of the times. And once again, Indian Air Force thought that they had got something of consequence that will restore the balance. So MiG-29 in 1986. However, IAF still wanted more Mirages, but at that point of time, it was difficult to fob off any pressures from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union then persuaded Indian government, at that point meaning Rajiv Gandhi's government, not to go for more Mirage 2000s, instead buy a whole bunch of MiG-23s and MiG-27s. That is the Flogger series from the Russians. These were swing-wing aircraft. If you go to Delhi airport, you can see one of them hanging, in fact, just to your right as you enter the departure lane at Indira Gandhi International Airport, Terminal 3. So these aircraft came in large numbers, one optimized to air-to-air warfare and the second optimized for ground support role. These aircraft had variable geometry, which means the wings can change their shape. You can take off with a lot more weight with spread out wings, and when you drop that weight, you want to be faster, you want to be niftier, you want to turn better, you can swing those wings back in. It was marvelous engineering of the kind that only the Soviets could do. However, this was not really contemporary with many other competitors that the Pakistanis had, particularly as they kept on acquiring more and more advanced versions or blocks, as these are called, of F-16s. Ultimately, they acquired the Block 52 series of F-16s. By the way, at this point, what is selling or what's the latest for F-16s is Block 70. That is what the Turks are going to buy in their fresh orders from the Americans. Now, this catch-up has continued and continues even now. When Balakot happened, for example, when Kargil happened, at that point of time, that was one of those brief junctures when Indian Air Force had a range and firepower superiority over Pakistan Air Force. In fact, as Anchit Gupta tells me, the only short junctures when IAF has had a range and firepower superiority over the PAF were the periods when Pakistan was under American sanctions. Any period when Pakistan was not under American sanctions, they found a way of staying ahead. Now the Pakistanis haven't got very much latest from America for a long time, but by this time the Chinese have caught up. with their technology and their weapon systems, including cutting edge stuff in military aviation. And that's what the Pakistanis are using right now. And that's what IAF is playing catch up on. Because all said and done, the only aircraft the IAF has which matches the best that the Pakistanis have, or the missiles that the Pakistanis have, are the Rafales. And that is just 2 squadrons. The rest IAF has been left behind. And that is what the IAF is hoping to do now with the retirement of the MiGs. With the retirement of the MiGs, maybe buy more Rafales. So fill up some squadrons quickly with contemporary aircraft. Also, then you get a critical mass of contemporary aircraft with the right kind of firepower, and also get more Tejases as quickly as possible, as quickly as HAL can deliver them, to fill up the other squadrons. Because the role of a fighter aircraft has now changed greatly. The role of a fighter aircraft is not just to fight the other side's aircraft. It is also to deliver standoff weapons from a safe distance, as we saw the IAF do on the morning of the 10th, and also during the day on the 10th of May. That's when all those Pakistani air bases were struck and wrecked. But also, if you see videos coming out of Ukraine now, you can see Ukrainian F-16s actually flying combat air patrols, not to fight Russian Air Force aircraft, because Russian Air Force aircraft are not coming into contested airspaces at all. They are being used, and they are running combat air patrols to shoot down Russian cruise missiles which are directed at Ukraine. So there is also a new role for faster, maybe smaller, niftier jet aircraft. And those are things for which an aircraft like Tejas is needed, but it's needed in the right kind of numbers. Right now, the numbers are too few. IAF is down to 29 squadrons. Now, this chronic pain with the Indian Air Force on acquisitions. See how this played out in the late 90s in the Vajpayee era. The Air Force wanted to buy more Mirage 2000s because Mirage 2000s had done brilliantly in Kargil. Ultimately, they tilted the balance because they were able to use precision guided munitions for the first time in the history of this subcontinent. IAF wanted more. The French wanted to sell more. The French wanted to shift the entire assembly line of Mirage 2000 to India. The problem was that this would have been a single vendor purchase. The Air Force went to the government and said, listen, don't make it a fresh purchase. Use it like a follow-on order. You already negotiated and bought 2 squadrons of Mirage 2000. This is just a follow-on order, because if you call it a standalone purchase, then you have to call competitive bids, and DPP comes in, Defense Procurement Procedure. That will take years and years and years. And Vajpayee government was inclined to do this. It was a great opportunity. And then the opportunity was lost. And you know why this opportunity was lost? Because in 2001 came out the Tehelka scam, or Operation West End. And that scared everybody in the system. It put George Fernandez under pressure. And the system then said, under no circumstances are we going to, number one, make a big defense purchase. And second, definitely not in an unconventional manner with a single vendor. So you can forget it. Indian Air Force, make do with what you have. And that's how Indian Air Force built even more MiG-21 squadrons, the newer variants, also modernized them even more, brought in a very new radar, etc. And also it built a much larger force of Sukhoi 30s than was initially planned when Narasimha Rao placed his first order in the last couple of weeks of his tenure in 1996. Now, the manner in which the MiG came to India and became its mainstay. I told you initially 6 came, then 6 more came. By that time, 3 were lost to accidents, then 3 were lost on day 1 and 2 of the 65 war. Then the numbers built up from 1966 onward. So the first 6 aircraft that came, they were called Type 74. Then the next 6 that came in 1965, that was called Type 76. Then came Type 77, the next edition that the Soviets produced. Those Mrs. Gandhi ordered in large numbers in March 1966, because India had learned from 65 war that it had a big gap to fill, because in the 1965 war, IAF was caught in a non-missile age and in a non-night fighting, non-night capability range, because the Pakistani fighters, particularly F-104s, could fly and fight at night. The Indian Air Force had nothing to counter that now. And also by this time, Mrs. Gandhi knew that India will not get anything from Western sources. Now something fortuitous happened in 1963 that changed the course of history for Indian Air Force. The reason it became a MiG-driven Air Force, because if you see 800, nearly 800, I think a little over 800 variants of the MiGs, MiG-21s had served with Indian Air Force. There were also MiG-23s, MiG-27s, MiG-29s, and for quite some time MiG-25s as well, although those were only used for photo reconnaissance role. Those were based in Bareilly. In fact, that squadron was called the Trisonics. Look at that aircraft and see how formidable that looks. That could fly at, I think, up to 90,000 feet. It used a special kind of fuel that did not need that much oxygen to burn. It could sweep all of the Tibetan border and back in one day, or all of the Pakistani border and our western borders in one day. So that also was a squadron. Indian Air Force used a lot of the MiGs and a lot of the MiG variants. However, in 1963, there was a chance that IAF would not have gone so heavily into MiGs and maybe would have had American fighter aircraft right through. And what happened in 1963? Krishna Menon was Nehru's defense minister. He did not want India buying any Western systems. He wanted India to buy, when Soviet systems became available and tensions started increasing between China and the Soviet Union, then he thought he will get some of this stuff from Soviet Union. So I told you the story of Nehru using the likelihood of his purchase of IL-28 bombers from Soviet Union for squeeze play with the Americans and the British. At the same time, Krishna Menon was working on it. So he had signed his agreement with the Soviets of selling India a bunch of MiGs in a flyaway condition on the understanding that in the course of time, as IAF needs more numbers, HAL will assemble these aircraft in India. So that bait was there. That's how these first 6 MiG-21s came. This is still 1963. But remember, when 1962 war came, America came to India's aid. America and its Western allies came to India's aid. And John F. Kennedy then said he was going to spend a lot of money in rearming India, because he figured that India needed to spend a lot more money on defense. So he drew up a $500 million or a $500 million plan then to rearm India. Now, $500 million in 1963, even if you use basic inflation today, would be about $6 billion. $6 billion is still serious money. To put $6 billion today or put $500 million in 1963 in perspective, I will tell you that India's defense budget in 1963, and this is the enhanced budget after the 1962 war, was just about 92 crore rupees. That is about 41.5 million, not billion, million with M, million dollars. In fact, in 1962, it was just about 70 crores. So this was going to be a lot of money, which would have done many things for India, including raise India's mountain divisions. That was the plan. However, White House was to have a meeting on November 26 of 1963 for taking a final decision on this plan and formally adopting it, after which the money and equipment would have started flowing in. But November 22, as we know, just 4 days before that is when Kennedy got assassinated. And then Johnson had no interest in this plan, and Nehru was declining in India in terms of his health, in terms of his mindset, and he did not live very long after that. And that's how that whole American connection died out. In fact, a lot more detail of this can be found in a book by Bruce Riedel, JFK's Forgotten Crisis, Tibet, the CIA, and the Sino-Indian War. This was published in 2015. Bruce Riedel was a very senior figure in the American intelligence system. In 1994, when I was investigating a very large cover story for India Today magazine, headline, which was published with the headline "Exporting Terror" on the globalization of jihad at that point of time, globalization of terrorism at that point of time, I had gone to meet Bruce Riedel at the National Security Council. He was a key figure and also a brilliant mind. He's written this book. If you are interested in history, please do check it out. Now, MiG-21 particularly has always been in news. One, it's been involved in almost every conflict that India has had. There was troubles with MiG-21. For example, between 1965 and 1971, many came with guns, many came without guns. So the first 6 had a gun on them. The next 6 had no gun on them. They just had those 2 very primitive missiles. Then India bought a bunch of guns that came separately. These guns, HAL was then to fit on externally on the MiG-21s. But it's the old story. HAL and the IAF, they blamed each other. When this 1971 war took place, Indian Air Force had 8 MiG-21 squadrons. However, in each squadron, only about a half had the gun incorporated. The rest still had those old style, old technology missiles, aim and shoot, old technology missiles. However, later versions then further improvements were made and the gun was also integrated internally. While in the first version, MiG-21 Type 74 as it was called, it had the gun because IAF wanted the gun. It did not have a radar. The fighter plane had no radar. And why did it not have the radar? Because the Soviet Design Bureau used the same space to fit the gun there. But then you figured that you needed the radar. And this went on, this tamasha went on through the 65 and 71 wars. It was subsequently that the gun was fitted internally on the aircraft. So that problem continued and that's how MiG-21 remained in use. The other thing is that until the last conflict of Sindoor, MiG-21 was always involved in action. In Kargil, it was involved in action. The aircraft that squadron leader Ajay Ahuja was flying was a MiG-21. Then Type 96 as it was called. This was from 17th Squadron, then a fighter reconnaissance squadron. And in the same year, a few months later, you remember that was that incident where a Pakistani Navy Atlantic reconnaissance aircraft had entered Indian airspace, was challenged by 2 MiG-21s and shot down. So that the pilot that fired missiles, those were R-60 Russian missiles. He had the choice of a French missile also, but he preferred to use a Russian missile. That was squadron leader Prashant Bundela. And then we remember post Balakot, Wing Commander Abhinandan Vartman. After that, the MiG hasn't seen active action. The MiG also saw a lot of controversies over accidents. Now, every time I raised that question, I was told that, look, if this is the bulk of your Air Force, it will have more accidents, right? Also, there was a period when for a long time, Indian Air Force did not have an advanced jet trainer. So people were going straight from basic jet trainer onto a very tough aircraft to fly because the MiG-21 has a very high angle of attack. What that means is it comes into land at a very high speed. Now, because there was a lot of controversy in 2001, 2002, I reached out to the Indian Air Force and I said, if you say this aircraft is all right, can you set me up to have a walk the talk with 2 active fighter pilots on MiG-21? And they were very open-minded about this. In 2003, they let me go to Ambala and let me talk to 2 pilots, Wing Commander Harish and then Flight Lieutenant Alok Thakur in Ambala. We spoke at the airbase with the aircraft taking off and landing right there, and they spoke about the aircraft with great warmth. I'm sharing a link to that walk the talk with you. And while you know the subject is MiG-21 now, let me also remind you that the 5th batch of the Print School of Journalism is now enrolling students. It's about to close its admission process. The 4 batches so far have done brilliantly. You've seen their graduates, you've seen their bylines on the print and elsewhere. You're doing very well. This is an opportunity to learn from senior editors and real practitioners at the print. This is direct mentorship from top journalists, some from outside the print as well. The Print School of Journalism will help you master smart writing, craft crisp, impactful stories for today's digital readers, get hands-on newsroom experience, write, edit, do graphics and learn from assignments. Learn to tell stories across formats, text, video, social media and features. You will also step into the newsroom because you get an internship. You will step into our newsroom with an internship and career-ready skills. So apply now because as I just told you, admission will be closing soon.